Charlotte sat stiffly in the worn leather chair, her fingers curled into tight fists on her lap. The dim office smelled of old books and something stale, something rotten. The heavy wooden desk that separated her from Mrs. Holloway, her legal guardian, felt more like a barrier, a final wall standing between her and whatever fate had already been decided. Mrs. Holloway's sharp eyes bore into her, but Charlotte refused to shrink under her gaze. "You should consider yourself lucky," the woman said, adjusting the stack of papers in front of her. Her voice was flat, businesslike. "You'll be well taken care of. Better than you deserve, really." Charlotte's stomach twisted. "You're selling me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Holloway sighed, as if Charlotte was being unreasonable. "It's an arrangement, a mutually beneficial one. Callum Whitmore is a powerful man. He needs a wife, and you—" She waved a dismissive hand. "You need a life." Charlotte's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to scream, to demand how a human being could be passed off like property. But deep down, she already knew the answer. She was nothing to this woman, nothing more than a burden to be discarded. A knock at the door made her breath hitch. Mrs. Holloway straightened, smoothing her blouse before calling, "Come in." The door swung open, and the air in the room seemed to shift. Callum Whitmore entered without hesitation, his presence cold and commanding. Tall, impeccably dressed, and with an air of detached indifference, he barely glanced at Charlotte before turning his attention to the papers on the desk. "This is her." His voice was smooth but devoid of warmth. Charlotte felt her body tense. He hadn't even looked at her properly. Mrs. Holloway nodded. "Everything is in order. Once you sign, she's yours. Yours." Charlotte's nails dug into her palms, a sharp reminder that she wasn't powerless, no matter how it seemed. She might have no choice in this moment, but she would not be broken. She lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet Callum's gaze as he finally looked at her. If he expected her to cower, to be meek and obedient, he would be disappointed, because no matter what happened next, she would survive. The ceremony was over before Charlotte could even process it. No grand hall, no flowers, no music. Just a cold exchange of vows in the private study of Callum Whitmore's estate, witnessed only by a lawyer and a housekeeper who looked as disinterested as the groom himself. The weight of the simple gold band on her finger felt heavier than it should, a symbol of a union that meant nothing. Callum hadn't so much as glanced at her throughout the brief ceremony, his responses clipped and devoid of any emotion. He had recited his vows like they were nothing more than a contract, and maybe to him, that's all they were. When it was done, he turned to the lawyer, not her. "Send the finalized paperwork to my office." Charlotte clenched her fists. Not even a pretense of civility. She had expected this to be humiliating, but somehow, his sheer indifference stung worse than outright cruelty. As they walked through the vast corridors of his estate, the silence between them was suffocating. She took in her surroundings, vaulted ceilings, expensive paintings, a home that seemed designed for someone who lived in luxury but never enjoyed it. At last, he stopped outside a grand bedroom door and faced her for the first time since the ceremony. His expression was unreadable, but his tone left no room for misinterpretation. "This is your room." Charlotte blinked. She hadn't expected warmth, but she had assumed, given the circumstances, that they would at least be forced to share a space. "And yours?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. Callum's gaze darkened. Elsewhere, something flickered in his expression, something almost like regret, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. "Obedience is all I expect from you, Charlotte," he continued. "Nothing more. We don't have to pretend." He didn't wait for a response before turning away, disappearing down the hall, leaving her alone with nothing but the echo of his footsteps. Later that night, as she lay in a bed too large, in a house too empty, she heard him mutter in the distance, low, bitter words she wasn't meant to catch. "Never again." The quiet confession sent a shiver down her spine. Never again what? The morning after the wedding, Charlotte woke to silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the eerie stillness of a house that wasn't meant to be lived in. The mansion was enormous. Every corridor stretched endlessly, filled with polished floors and priceless artwork. Yet there was no warmth, no trace of life within its walls. It was a house built for power, not for comfort. As she wandered through the halls, trying to familiarize herself with her new prison, she noticed something unsettling. The few staff she encountered, housekeepers, a butler, and a cook, moved about efficiently, never pausing, never acknowledging her presence for longer than necessary. When she attempted to speak to a maid, the young woman flinched, murmured an apology, and hurried away. It wasn't just that they avoided her. It was the way their eyes darted nervously when she mentioned Callum, as if they feared even saying his name too loudly. Charlotte clenched her fists. What had she gotten herself into? The unease followed her as she explored deeper into the house. She had no destination in mind, only the need to move, to breathe, to feel something other than trapped. That was when she found it. At the far end of the third floor, past a series of guest rooms and an office, she came across a door unlike the others. It wasn't just closed, it was locked. It wouldn't have meant much, except every other room in the house had been left open, accessible. This door, however, was different. The wood was dark and heavy, the handle an elegant brass, but what caught her attention was the faint scratch marks near the keyhole. Someone had tried to open it before. A chill ran through her. What was behind that door? And why did she have the distinct feeling that whatever it was, she wasn't supposed to know? A soft sound behind her made her turn. A maid stood a few feet away, clutching a tray, her eyes wide. When she saw what Charlotte was looking at, her expression turned pale. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, voice barely audible. Charlotte's pulse quickened. "Why not?" The maid hesitated, glancing nervously around as if afraid of being caught talking to her. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her steps hurried. Charlotte stayed where she was, staring at the locked door. The mansion was full of secrets, and this one was begging to be uncovered. Charlotte found Callum in his office that evening, seated behind an imposing mahogany desk. The dim lighting cast sharp shadows across his face, making his already unreadable expression even harder to decipher. He didn't acknowledge her presence at first, his eyes scanning the papers before him as if she weren't even there. She refused to be ignored. "What's behind the locked door on the third floor?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. Callum's hand froze mid-motion, the pin between his fingers pausing just enough for her to notice. Then, slowly, he set it down. Only then did he look at her. His gaze was sharp, assessing. "You've been wandering." "I live here now," she countered. "Should I confine myself to my room?" A muscle in his jaw twitched. "You should know which lines not to cross." Charlotte lifted her chin. "Why is it locked?" The shift in the air was almost imperceptible, but she felt it. His cold detachment wavered for just a second, just long enough for something darker to seep through, something that almost looked like pain. "You will not go near that door again." His voice was quiet, but laced with steel. She folded her arms. "So there is something to hide." Callum pushed back from his desk, standing to his full height. The sudden movement made her pulse quicken, but she refused to step back. "You don't understand this world, Charlotte," he said, voice low. "You don't understand me." She held his gaze, searching for any crack in the carefully placed armor he wore. For a moment, she thought she saw it, something raw and buried deep. But then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. "Stay away from that door," he repeated, stepping past her toward the exit. And then, just as he reached the doorway, he stopped. Without turning back, he said something almost too quiet to hear. "Some things are better left locked away." Then he was gone, leaving Charlotte standing in the dimly lit office, her heart pounding. She knew one thing for certain. Whatever was behind that door was important to him, and that only made her more determined to find out the truth. Charlotte had never been surrounded by so much wealth. The ballroom gleamed under chandeliers that cast golden light across polished marble floors. Guests in tailored suits and glittering gowns floated effortlessly through conversations, their laughter practiced, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. She stood beside Callum, a stranger in this world of effortless privilege. He had barely spoken to her since they arrived, treating her as nothing more than an accessory, something to complete the image of a powerful, respectable businessman. You're holding your glass too tightly, he murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear. Charlotte forced herself to loosen her grip on the delicate crystal flute of champagne, feeling exposed under the weight of 100 careful glances. The moment was interrupted by a voice dripping with amusement. Callum Whitmore, finally tamed? Charlotte turned to see a man approaching, tall, effortlessly charming, his grin bordering on arrogance. Graham Sterling. She recognized him from whispers among the guests. Callum's business partner, or rather, his competitor in everything but name. Callum's shoulders stiffened. Graham. Graham ignored him, his attention sliding to Charlotte instead. His gaze was calculated, studying her as if trying to unravel her secrets. "And you must be the new Mrs. Whitmore," he said, offering his hand. "Graham Sterling. But I imagine Callum hasn't told you much about me." Charlotte hesitated before shaking his hand. His grip was warm, confident. Too confident. "Charlotte," she said simply. "Ah, she has a name. That's promising." Graham's smirk deepened as he turned back to Callum. "And here I was thinking you'd married a ghost, considering how little you speak of her." Charlotte felt Callum tense beside her. "I don't recall inviting you to this conversation," Callum said, his tone clipped. Graham ignored him. "Tell me, Charlotte, has our dear Callum been treating you well? Or has he been his usual, emotionally unavailable self?" Charlotte barely had time to respond before she felt Callum's hand at the small of her back, guiding, no, pulling, her away. The forcefulness of it sent a clear message. "Enjoy the party, Sterling," Callum muttered over his shoulder before steering Charlotte through the crowd. When they were finally alone on the balcony, Charlotte pulled away. "What was that?" Callum's jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides. "You don't engage with men like him," he said simply. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. "Because he's dangerous, or because he got under your skin?" Callum didn't answer, but his silence told her everything. The gala had begun to die down, but Charlotte wasn't ready to return to the suffocating silence of Callum's mansion just yet. She wandered through the dimly lit corridors of the venue, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The air was cooler here, away from the warmth of forced conversations and practiced smiles. Then she heard them, Callum and Graham. Their voices were low, sharp. There was tension in the air, thick enough that Charlotte hesitated before stepping closer, pressing herself against the wall just outside the open doorway. "You're slipping, Callum," Graham said, his tone edged with amusement. "I wonder what she would think." Silence. Then, Callum's voice, tight with restraint. "Don't." Graham chuckled. "Oh, so we can't even say her name anymore? Elena Carter." "There, I said it." "Did it burn?" Charlotte's breath hitched. She couldn't see them, but she could feel the shift in the room. Whatever this was, it was personal. "Elena is dead to me." Callum's voice was cold, but there was something else beneath it, something raw. "Graham Tsged. That's rich, coming from you." More silence. Charlotte's mind raced. Who was Elena Carter? A former lover? Someone who had hurt him? Callum didn't speak again, but the air crackled with unspoken words. Then, finally, footsteps. Charlotte turned quickly, slipping behind a corner as Callum strode past, his expression unreadable, his shoulders stiff with something that looked suspiciously like pain. Graham followed moments later, his expression one of quiet amusement. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve before walking away in the opposite direction. Charlotte exhaled slowly, her heartbeat steady but her thoughts anything but. Elena Carter. She had never seen Callum react to anything the way he had in that moment. Whatever had happened between him and this woman, it had left a scar deep enough that even the mention of her name could shake his composure. Did he love her? Did he still? Charlotte's fingers curled at her sides. Whatever this was, it mattered, and she was going to find out why. Charlotte found Callum in the library later that night, sitting in an armchair by the grand fireplace. The dim glow of the flames cast flickering shadows across his face, making his sharp features look even more unreadable. A glass of whiskey rested on the table beside him, untouched. She hesitated before stepping inside, but the frustration swirling in her chest pushed her forward. You don't talk much about yourself, she said, keeping her tone casual, as if she hadn't just spent the last hour unraveling the name Elena Carter in her mind. Callum didn't look at her. There's not much to say. Charlotte exhaled, stepping closer. That's not true. People don't flinch when they hear a name unless it means something. His fingers tightened around the armrest. You were eavesdropping. She ignored the accusation. Who was she? Silence. Then, finally, Callum turned his gaze to her, his expression unreadable but his eyes. They weren't as cold as before. Elena doesn't concern you. Charlotte scoffed, folding her arms. You married me. I think that gives me the right to ask questions. His jaw tensed, as if the truth was pressing against his teeth, fighting to stay inside. Then, suddenly, he stood. Charlotte stepped back instinctively as he approached, not out of fear but from the sheer intensity in his eyes. He stopped just inches away from her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, the way it unsettled her. You think because we stood in front of a priest and signed a piece of paper that you know me? His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it sent a shiver down her spine. You don't. Her heart pounded, but she refused to back down. I think you want me to believe that, she said. I think you like pretending you don't feel anything. His breath hitched, but just as quickly, he smirked, cold, dismissive. You think you understand me, Charlotte? She could feel the tension crackling between them, something unspoken stretching and pulling, daring one of them to break. Outside, the wind whispered through the open balcony doors, carrying the soft strains of distant music from the party still lingering below. Callum stepped past her, heading toward the balcony. The night air rushed in as he leaned against the railing. For reasons she didn't understand, Charlotte followed. The music drifted up from below, soft, haunting, almost melancholic. Callum exhaled, running a hand through his hair before turning to face her. There was something in his eyes now, a hesitation, a question. Then, without a word, he extended his hand. Charlotte's pulse stuttered. She could have walked away. Should have, maybe. Instead, she placed her hand in his. His fingers curled around hers. Not possessive, not demanding, just steady. He guided her into a slow, quiet dance. No grand gestures, no words. Just movement, the space between them charged with something neither of them dared to name. Charlotte felt the shift, the way his grip softened, the way his body moved with hers in perfect rhythm. It was fleeting, fragile, like something they weren't meant to touch. Then, just as quickly as it had started, Callum let go. Stepping back, he ran a hand over his face, as if shaking off whatever had just passed between them. This was a mistake, he muttered, turning away. Charlotte stood frozen for a moment, her fingers tingling from where he had held them. Maybe he was right, but for the first time, she wasn't sure she believed him. Charlotte wasn't sure what drove her to do it. Maybe it was the way Callum had pulled away after their dance, retreating further into his walls. Maybe it was the name Elena Carter, still echoing in her mind. Or maybe it was simply the knowledge that Callum had secrets. Secrets that were locked away, quite literally, on the third floor. She found the key in the study, hidden among a set of others in an old wooden box. The weight of it in her palm sent a shiver through her, a warning she ignored as she made her way up the dimly lit stairs. The house was quiet, the late hour ensuring that no one would question her presence. The door stood where she had last seen it, dark wood, elegant brass handle, and the undeniable feeling that it was guarding something important. Charlotte hesitated only for a second before slipping the key into the lock. A soft click echoed through the hallway. The air inside was stale, untouched. Moonlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting pale light over a room that had been preserved in time. It wasn't a bedroom. It was a study, smaller than the grand one Callum used, but far more personal. Books lined the walls, but what caught Charlotte's attention was the desk. Scattered papers, a framed photo lying face down. Her fingers trembled as she reached for it, turning it over. A younger Callum stared back at her, his expression softer than she had ever seen. Beside him stood a woman. Dark hair, striking eyes, her smile one of effortless joy. Elena. Charlotte barely had time to process the image before a voice, sharp and laced with fury, shattered the silence. "What the hell are you doing?" Her breath caught as she turned. Callum stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable for a second. Then, like a storm rolling in, his face twisted with rage. "You had no right," he snapped, stepping into the room. Charlotte gripped the frame tighter. "Who was she?" His eyes darkened. "Put that down." "Was she your wife?" She pressed, refusing to back down. "Your lover?" His jaw clenched, his entire body coiled like a predator ready to strike. "She was my fiancée." Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. He advanced on her, ripping the frame from her hands before she could react. His grip on it was tight, as if it physically pained him to hold it. "She betrayed me." The words were like ice, sharp and unforgiving. Charlotte searched his face, but all she found was the cold, impenetrable mask he always wore. She wanted to ask more, but she could feel it, the rage simmering beneath his skin, the rawness he was fighting so hard to contain. He took a breath, then another. When he finally spoke again, his voice was eerily calm. "Get out." Charlotte hesitated. "Callum, get out." The finality in his tone sent a chill down her spine. She turned and left without another word. As she shut the door behind her, she could hear the faint sound of glass shattering inside. Callum Whitmore was not an easy man to break, but Elena Carter had managed to do it. And now, Charlotte wasn't sure she wanted to know how. Charlotte had spent the rest of the night replaying the confrontation in her mind. Callum's fury, his clenched fists, the way his voice had cracked, just slightly, when he said she betrayed me. It wasn't just anger. It was pain, deep, unresolved, and buried beneath years of control. But why? What had Elena done to him? Charlotte knew she wouldn't get answers from Callum. Not now. Not when he was still simmering with the kind of rage that made it dangerous to even approach him. So when Graham Sterling found her the next afternoon at a quiet corner of Callum's estate, she wasn't entirely surprised. "Interesting little habit you have," Graham mused, leaning against a marble pillar with a glass of whiskey in hand, lurking in empty spaces. "Almost makes me wonder if you're looking for ghosts." Charlotte folded her arms. "What do you want, Graham?" He smirked. Straight to the point. "I like that." He took a slow sip of his drink, watching her over the rim. "Let me guess. You found the room." Charlotte's heartbeat quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. Graham chuckled. "Oh, don't look so alarmed. I knew you would, eventually. You seem curious." He let the word linger. Callum's never been good at hiding his pain. He likes to pretend he is. But that locked door? He tilted his head. That's the wound he never closed. Charlotte exhaled slowly. "And you're here because—" "Because I like watching people poke the beast," Graham said with a grin. "And because I have something you want." She hesitated. "What do you mean?" "Elena," he said, and the name sent a sharp wave of tension through her body. "I know what happened. The truth. Not the version Callum has convinced himself of." Charlotte's pulse pounded. "Why would you tell me?" "Because it'll be fun." His smirk widened. "And because Callum will never tell you himself. He'd rather burn than let you see his scars." She swallowed. "How do I know you're not lying?" "You don't," he admitted, taking another sip of whiskey. "But if you're as smart as I think you are, you'll realize that I have nothing to gain from lying. If anything, I prefer you stay in the dark. You, in particular, are quite the problem for him." Charlotte frowned. "What does that mean?" Graham only smiled. "You're getting to him, sweetheart. Whether you realize it or not." Her stomach twisted. She hated how much that possibility mattered. Graham straightened, finishing his drink. "So, what's it going to be? Do you want the truth? Or are you going to pretend, like Callum, that some doors are better left locked?" Charlotte hesitated. She knew this was dangerous. She knew Graham was playing a game, and she was nothing more than a piece on the board. But she also knew that not knowing would eat her alive. She lifted her chin. "Tell me." Graham's grin widened. "Oh, darling," he mused. "I thought you'd never asked." Graham didn't rush his story. He savored it, watching Charlotte's face with the same kind of amusement one might have while unraveling a well-kept secret. "Elena Carter," he said, Swirling the last of his whiskey in his glass was Callum's fiancée. Everyone believed she betrayed him, ran off with something he valued. But the truth? He leaned in slightly. She didn't run. She disappeared. Charlotte frowned. Disappeared? Graham smirked. One day, she was here, in this very house, planning a future with your husband. The next? Gone. No trace. No goodbyes. Just vanished. Charlotte felt a chill settle over her. And Callum thinks she betrayed him? Oh, he doesn't think it. He's convinced of it. Graham tapped a finger against his glass. That's how Callum works. He doesn't believe in unanswered questions. He doesn't accept them. If he can't explain something, he shapes his own reality until it fits. Charlotte's stomach twisted. She remembered the way Callum had reacted when she asked about Elena, the fury in his voice when he said she betrayed me. But if what Graham was saying was true, what really happened to her? She asked. Graham chuckled. That, my dear, is the million-dollar question. Charlotte narrowed her eyes. You don't know? Oh, I have my theories. He flashed a grin. But you're the one who wants to play detective. I'd hate to take the fun away from you. Frustration burned in Charlotte's chest. But Graham had already begun stepping back, his job done. One last thing, he said, pausing near the doorway. If I were you, I'd be careful where I dig. Sometimes, when you find the truth, you wish you hadn't. Then he was gone, leaving Charlotte alone with thoughts that refused to settle. She had to tell Callum. She found him in his study, sitting behind his desk, deep in thought. The moment she stepped inside, his expression darkened, as if he already knew she was about to say something he didn't want to hear. What is it, Charlotte? His voice was low, weary. She hesitated, but only for a second. I spoke to Graham. His jaw tightened. Of course you did. He told me about Elena. At that, Callum's entire body went rigid. Charlotte took a breath. He said she didn't betray you. She disappeared. Silence. For a brief moment, something flickered in Callum's eyes, something uncertain. But then, just as quickly, it was replaced by cold, unshakable conviction. I don't have time for Graham's games, he said, standing abruptly. He wasn't playing a game, Charlotte argued. You're holding on to a version of the truth that makes sense to you. But what if you're wrong? What if something happened to her? Callum's gaze snapped to hers, sharp and dangerous. Enough. Charlotte didn't flinch. You need to consider the possibility that... I said enough. His voice was like ice, cutting and absolute. Charlotte's chest ached at the finality in his tone. Why won't you even listen? He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Because I don't need to. Frustration swelled in her. You're so determined to protect yourself from the past that you refuse to see it for what it is. Callum stepped closer, and for the first time, there was no anger in his face, just exhaustion. No, Charlotte, I see it exactly for what it is, and I refuse to relive it. His words felt like a door slamming shut. Charlotte searched his face, looking for something, anything, that would make him reconsider. But Callum Whitmore was a man who had made up his mind. She had lost this battle. For now. Charlotte sat in the dimly lit drawing room, staring at the crackling fire. The conversation with Callum had left a bitter taste in her mouth, but more than that, it left a sharp ache in her chest. He was shutting her out, refusing to see what was right in front of him. She wasn't going to let him. The sound of approaching footsteps made her lift her head. Callum. He didn't speak at first, just stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. The firelight flickered against his sharp features, casting long shadows over his face. Why are you still here? He asked, his voice quieter than usual. Charlotte met his gaze without hesitation. Because I'm not giving up on you. A muscle in his jaw tensed. You don't even know what that means. She stood, closing the space between them. I know that you're holding on to something that's killing you. And I know you push people away because it's easier than letting them in. He exhaled harshly, raking a hand through his hair. You don't understand. Then make me understand. Silence stretched between them. Charlotte's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. Callum was breaking in front of her, piece by piece, and she wasn't about to let him retreat into himself again. You think I don't see you? she whispered. That I don't see the way you look at me, like I'm something you don't want to want? His breath hitched. Something in him cracked then, something raw and unguarded. Before she could say another word, Callum closed the distance between them in one swift motion. His hands gripped her waist, his breath warm against her skin for the briefest of seconds before his lips crashed against hers. It wasn't careful. It wasn't hesitant. It was desperate, hungry. Charlotte gasped against his mouth, her fingers curling into his shirt, pulling him closer. The heat between them was electric, months of tension finally spilling over into something neither of them could control. Callum's grip tightened, as if he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. But just as quickly as it had started, he pulled away, breathing heavily. His forehead rested against hers for a moment, his fingers still clutching her waist. "This is a mistake," he murmured, but there was no conviction behind his words. Charlotte's chest rose and fell rapidly. "Then why did you kiss me?" He swallowed hard, his thumb brushing absently against her hip. "Because you make me forget why I shouldn't." Charlotte reached up, gently cupping his face. "Then stop trying to fight it." His eyes darkened, a war raging behind them. But instead of answering, he stepped back, his hands slipping away from her body. "I can't." The words were barely audible, but they sliced through her all the same. Without another word, he turned and left, leaving Charlotte standing alone in the dimly lit room, her lips still tingling from his touch. She had gotten through to him, but Callum Whitmore was still his own worst enemy. And for now, he was determined to keep fighting a battle he was destined to lose. Charlotte had barely slept since that night with Callum. His kiss still lingered on her lips, the heat of it branding something deep inside her. But it was the way he pulled away, the way he looked at her like he was drowning and refusing to let her save him, that haunted her more. She was tired of waiting for Callum to trust her. She would find the truth herself, but she never expected the truth to find her first. She was in the garden when Graham appeared, stepping through the trimmed hedges like he belonged there. "You look troubled, darling." His voice was light, but his eyes, sharp and assessing, made her stomach tighten. Charlotte turned to leave, but he blocked her path with a casual step forward. "Running already?" He smirked. "You wound me." She folded her arms. "I have nothing to say to you." "Oh, but I have so much to say to you." His expression shifted, something more dangerous sliding into his gaze. "Like the truth about Elena." Charlotte stilled. Graham let the silence stretch, watching her reaction. So he hasn't told you everything." Her pulse quickened. "I know she disappeared." Graham chuckled. "That's one way to put it." Charlotte forced herself to stay calm. "And I suppose you know more?" "I do." He tilted his head, feigning sympathy. "And I'm here to offer you a choice." She clenched her fists. "A choice?" Graham stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You stop digging. You stop pushing Callum to remember things best left buried. And in return, I keep his empire intact." Charlotte frowned. "What are you talking about?" Graham exhaled, almost disappointed. "For someone so clever, you still don't see it, do you?" Her fingers curled against her palms as he leaned in. Elena didn't just disappear. She was erased. Charlotte's breath caught. Graham smiled. "And Callum's hands? They aren't as clean as you think." Her heart pounded. "You're lying." Graham arched a brow. "Am I?" Charlotte shook her head. "If Callum did something to her, why would you protect him?" "Because," Graham said smoothly, "the truth would ruin everything." His voice turned softer, coaxing. "So here's your choice, Charlotte. Walk away from this. Be the perfect little wife. And Callum never has to know that you were the reason his entire world came crashing down." Charlotte swallowed hard. Graham leaned back, satisfied. "Smart girl like you will make the right decision." Then he turned, disappearing as swiftly as he had arrived, leaving Charlotte frozen in place, the weight of his words settling like ice in her veins. She had wanted the truth. Now she wasn't sure she could live with it. Charlotte's mind raced as she returned to the estate, Graham's words echoing in her ears. Elena was erased. Callum's hands aren't as clean as you think. And now, she was faced with an impossible choice. Keep quiet and protect Callum, or seek the truth and risk destroying him. Her stomach twisted. There was no right answer. But she knew one thing for certain. Graham couldn't win. She found Callum in his study, standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The storm outside cast streaks of lightning across the sky, illuminating his silhouette in brief flashes. He didn't turn when she entered. "Callum," she began carefully. "What did he say to you?" His voice was low, controlled. Charlotte hesitated. She couldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. She had to find another way to stop Graham without shattering whatever fragile connection she had built with Callum. "He was trying to manipulate me," she said instead. "Trying to make me doubt you." Callum finally turned, his expression unreadable. "And did it work?" Charlotte stepped closer. "I don't believe him." She wanted to reach for him, to bridge the distance between them. But something in his eyes stopped her. "You're lying." Charlotte's stomach dropped. "What?" His grip on the glass tightened. "You hesitated." She swallowed hard. "Callum, you think I don't know what's happening?" His voice was sharper now, edged with something dark. "You've been asking questions, searching for answers I never wanted you to find." Charlotte's breath hitched. "I just want to help you." His expression twisted. "You want to help me?" He let out a humorless laugh. "You think you can fix me, Charlotte? That you can come into my life and dig through my past like you have any right to it?" She flinched. "That's not what this is." This marriage was a business transaction. His voice was cold now, cutting through the air like a blade. "You are nothing to me." The words struck like a physical blow. Charlotte felt her throat tighten, but she refused to let him see how deeply it hurt. "I don't believe you," she whispered. Callum's jaw tensed, and for a moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Regret, doubt, something real. But then, he turned away. "Go back to your room, Charlotte." Her breath trembled. "Callum, please." He didn't look at her as he spoke the final words that shattered her completely. "You were a mistake." Silence stretched between them, heavy and final. Then, without another word, he walked out of the study, leaving Charlotte alone in the storm's fading light. And for the first time since she had been forced into this marriage, she felt truly alone. Charlotte packed in silence. She wasn't sure how long she stood in her room, numb fingers folding clothes she wasn't even certain belonged to her. The walls that had once felt like a prison now felt empty, like she had already disappeared from them before even walking out the door. Callum's words echoed in her head. "You were a mistake." She had been foolish. Foolish to believe he could change. Foolish to think the way he had kissed her, the way he had held her, meant something. Maybe to her, it had. But to him? Nothing. She wiped at her cheeks hastily, shoving the last of her things into a small travel bag. She wasn't taking much, just what she had brought with her the day she arrived. Because none of this belonged to her. And now, neither did he. The house was quiet as she walked down the grand staircase. The staff had learned to stay out of her way, their wary glances only deepening her resolve. She wouldn't say goodbye. Not to the house. Not to him. She reached the front door, pausing for only a second. It was strange. How easy it was to leave when staying had felt impossible. Her fingers hovered over the handle, hesitating just long enough to wonder if he would stop her. But the silence remained unbroken. Callum wasn't coming. Of course, he wasn't. With one last breath, she stepped outside and disappeared into the night. Callum sat in his office, staring at the amber liquid in his glass. The storm had passed, leaving behind only an eerie stillness. He should have felt relieved. He should have felt in control, now that he had pushed her away. But instead, he felt nothing. He rubbed at his temple, exhaling sharply. He had meant what he said, hadn't he? She had no place in his world. No place in the life he had built around cold walls and locked doors. Then why did the house feel so much emptier without her? A knock sounded at the door. His butler stood stiffly in the doorway. "Sir." Callum barely glanced up. "What is it?" The man hesitated. "Mrs. Whitmore has left." Something in his chest tightened. "Gone?" His own voice sounded foreign. "Yes, sir. She took her things." No word on where she went. Callum's grip on his glass tightened. He had told her to go. He had told her she was nothing to him. So why did it feel like the ground had just shifted beneath him? The butler cleared his throat. Should I have someone locate her? Callum's jaw clenched. The answer should have been no. But the only word he could force out was, go. The butler bowed slightly and exited the room, leaving Callum alone. Alone. The way he had wanted to be. The way he had always been. Then why did it feel like he had just lost the only thing that had ever made him feel alive? The wind whispered through the open window of Callum's study, rustling the scattered pages on his desk. He stood there, silent, as his trusted investigator recounted the details no one had dared to bring to light. Graham had orchestrated everything. Elena's disappearance, Charlotte's forced silence, even the friction that drove her away. Somehow, Graham had turned the very walls of Callum's home into instruments of betrayal, and Callum, blinded by his own pain, had played right into his hands. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, the realization settling in like a slow ache. Everything he thought he knew, about Elena, about Charlotte, had been based on half-truths and twisted lies. "I'm sorry, sir." The investigator's voice was low but steady. Miss Carter never willingly left. Graham made sure of that. And as for Mrs. Whitmore, she was doing what she thought would protect you, protect him. His throat tightened at the thought of Charlotte standing her ground, despite the danger. And in response, he had pushed her away with words he could never take back. He stared at the crumpled file on his desk, his mind spiraling back to every moment he had doubted her, every time he had accused her of meddling in things she couldn't understand. She had understood more than he ever gave her credit for, and she was gone. "Where is he?" Callum asked, his voice strained. "Graham?" The investigator shook his head. "He's vanished too, but we're working on it." Callum nodded, a wave of anger coursing through him. For so long, he had blamed Elena for betraying him, convinced that she had walked away by choice. He had convinced himself no one could be trusted, that every gesture of kindness was just another setup for heartbreak. Charlotte had tried to tell him. She had tried to warn him that things weren't as they seemed. And what had he done? He had told her she was a mistake. The file on his desk was all that remained of Graham's deception. Statements, falsified records, evidence that Elena had been threatened, then quietly taken out of Callum's life before she could speak the truth. He sank into his chair, staring at the tangled mess. Guilt pressed down on him, heavier than any deal he'd ever negotiated. He had let his past blind him, and in doing so, he had lost the one person who had tried to help. "Find Graham," he finally said, voice low. "And find my wife." The investigator nodded. "Yes, sir." When he was alone again, Callum let out a tremulous breath. Every pulse in his body urged him to go after Charlotte, to explain everything, to beg her forgiveness. But first, he had to finish what she started. He had to face the consequences of Graham's betrayal, of his own ignorance. He had to make it right, because if he didn't, he would lose Charlotte forever. Callum stood at the edge of the abandoned warehouse, heart pounding like a warning drum in his chest. Shadows stretched across the cracked concrete, long and menacing, as if reflecting the tension that gripped him. He had finally traced Graham's location to this forgotten part of the city, a place that echoed with the ghosts of failures and broken deals. The investigator's tip had been solid. Graham had been spotted coming and going under cover of darkness. Now, the time for half measures was over. Callum had to confront him. As he stepped inside, the musty air and flickering overhead lights made his skin crawl. Torn shipping crates lay scattered across the floor, and the dripping of a distant pipe marked the seconds like a metronome. He had no illusions about why Graham was hiding here. The man had orchestrated Elena's disappearance, manipulated Charlotte, and capitalized on every insecurity Callum possessed. There was no telling how far Graham would go to protect his secrets. The clang of metal startled Callum. A shadow moved on the upper balcony, and then Graham's unmistakable figure emerged. He leaned over the railing with a mocking smile. "I was wondering when you'd show up," he called, voice echoing in the cavernous space. Callum's jaw tensed. "We end this tonight," Graham chuckled, stepping forward so the dim light illuminated his features. "And what, exactly? The empire we built together? Your delusions about Elena? Or your pathetic attempts to be free of your past?" A flash of anger coursed through Callum. He clenched his fists at his sides, forcing himself to stay focused. Stop playing games. Tell me what happened to Elena. Tell me why you orchestrated all of this. Graham's gaze darkened, but his lips curved into a grin. You still don't get it, do you? Power, Callum, control. You never appreciated what you had. You were too busy burying your head in grief to see the opportunities right in front of you. He took a step closer to the railing. Elena was an inconvenience. She threatened everything we were building. Her conscience, her willingness to question the deals we made. So I removed her. Callum's blood ran cold. She didn't betray me. You did. Believe whatever helps you sleep at night, Graham said with a dismissive shrug. But we both know you're here for more than Elena. You're here because of Charlotte. The sound of her name on Graham's lips made Callum's heart twist. Guilt, regret, and a simmering rage welled up within him. He thought of Charlotte's determined eyes, her unyielding spirit, and the way he had pushed her away out of fear. I won't let you drag her into this. Graham laughed, a hollow echo against the walls. Too late. She was already a pawn the moment she stepped into your life. The question is, are you going to save her, or watch her walk away forever? Callum moved toward the stairs leading up to the balcony, every muscle coiled. He could feel the adrenaline surging through his veins, urging him to end Graham's twisted game once and for all. Halfway up, he saw the glint of metal. Graham was pulling a small firearm from his jacket. Instincts took over. Callum dove to the side as a shot reverberated in the empty space. The bullet ricocheted off a steel beam, sparks flying. Is that all you've got? Callum growled, adrenaline fueling his every breath. He scrambled to take cover behind a crate, the acrid smell of gunpowder searing his lungs. Graham descended the stairs, steps echoing through the gloom. You always did underestimate me, he taunted, pistol aimed with unsettling steadiness. Callum's mind raced. He needed a plan, a moment to catch Graham off guard. Another gunshot shattered a nearby crate, splintering wood in all directions. He grit his teeth, darting behind another makeshift barrier. Before Graham could fire again, the warehouse door slammed open. Shock seized Callum as he saw a familiar figure step into the faint light. Charlotte. Her eyes were filled with determination, her posture rigid despite the danger. Graham turned, momentarily startled, and Callum took the chance to lunge. In the same instant, Charlotte sprinted forward, calling out to him. The shot rang out before Callum could stop it. Time seemed to slow. Charlotte threw herself between the two men, arms raised as if to shield Callum. The bullet grazed her shoulder, causing her to stagger backward. A sharp cry escaped her lips, sending terror surging through Callum's veins. Rage and fear collided inside him, propelling him toward Graham with a roar. He wrested the gun from Graham's hand, knocking it to the floor where it skidded across the concrete. Graham stumbled, losing his balance under Callum's onslaught. For a moment, Callum was tempted to unleash all his fury. But the sight of Charlotte, wounded and gasping, steadied him. He pinned Graham down, breathing heavily. You took Elena from me, he growled. You tried to destroy Charlotte. You will never hurt anyone again. Graham sneered, still defiant. You don't have the nerve to finish this. Callum spared him a final glare before rising. You're not worth it. He rushed to Charlotte's side, gently cradling her as she pressed a hand against the wound on her shoulder. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp with relief. Why did you come back? He whispered, voice tight with concern. She winced, managing a shaky smile. Because I couldn't let you face him alone. Callum's throat tightened. He wanted to say 1,000 things, to apologize, to confess how wrong he had been, how much he needed her. Instead, he held her close, silently vowing never to let her slip away again. Graham lay on the floor, cuffed by the investigator who had arrived moments later, and as the sirens echoed in the distance, Callum felt something break inside him. A final barrier crashing down, leaving raw honesty in its place. Charlotte had risked her life for him. He would spend the rest of his days proving he deserved that kind of loyalty. Callum held Charlotte in the back seat of the investigator's car, trying to keep her conscious as they sped away from the warehouse. Her shoulder wound throbbed beneath the makeshift bandage, but she insisted it was only a graze. He had never felt so powerless. When they finally reached the estate, the world was bathed in the faint glow of early morning. The investigator helped him carry Charlotte inside. Callum refused to let anyone else tend to her, guiding her gently to a small sitting room where the staff hurried to bring medical supplies. She grimaced as he pressed fresh gauze to her shoulder, but she met his worried gaze with steady eyes. "I'm all right," she murmured, trying to smile. He shook his head. "You took a bullet meant for me." His voice cracked with guilt. "Don't ever do that again." She gave a weak laugh, wincing at the movement. "I couldn't just stand by." Her unwavering resolve humbled him. For so long, he had believed he was beyond saving, that no one could reach the parts of him he'd sealed away. Yet here she was, hurt because she'd refused to abandon him. He felt the dam inside him break. The wave of regret was overwhelming. Every harsh word he'd thrown at her, every moment he'd pushed her away. He gathered her into his arms, cradling her head against his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice raw. "I'm so sorry, Charlotte. I was blind and angry and—" He trailed off, his throat too tight to speak. Charlotte pressed a trembling hand to his cheek, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. Her simple words undid him. The walls he had built around his heart crumbled, leaving him exposed in a way he had never been. Tears burned behind his eyes, but he couldn't bring himself to hide them. "Don't leave," he pleaded, voice shaking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I know I've said things I can't take back, but I can't live without you." She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks as she leaned into his touch. "Callum." He brushed a tear away with the pad of his thumb, every breath shaking. "I love you," he said, the words tumbling out like a confession. "I love you so much it terrifies me." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Then Charlotte exhaled, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering pain. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, sliding her good arm around him. Callum pulled her closer, pressing his forehead against hers. In that moment, all he could feel was the thunderous beat of his heart and the warmth of her breath on his skin. He had nearly lost her, lost himself, to the lies and guilt he'd carried for years. But now, as he held Charlotte, he allowed himself to hope. The next few days blurred into a mix of relief and quiet determination. Graham's arrest had made headlines, and the investigators brought forth a damning list of charges linked to corruption, extortion, and possibly worse. Every shred of evidence he had used to control Callum's empire now worked against him. Callum watched from afar as the authorities led Graham away in handcuffs. He didn't feel triumph. Instead, a sober realization weighed on him. Everything he had once built with this man, every deal they had struck, every ounce of trust he had given, it had all been a lie. Yet, Callum couldn't focus on that bitterness for long. His attention kept drifting back to Charlotte. She was healing from her shoulder wound, which thankfully required only minimal medical treatment. The bullet had grazed her, leaving a shallow laceration and a lingering ache. Callum insisted on hiring a private doctor to ensure her recovery. At first, she resisted his fussing, but eventually she relented, if only to quell his guilt. Most nights, she rested in his bed, no longer relegated to a separate room. He would sit beside her, tentative at first, holding her hand while she drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes she would stir, whispering his name, and Callum would be there, quietly reassuring her that she was safe. On the third morning after Graham's arrest, Callum guided Charlotte to the mansion's rose garden, the one place that held any semblance of warmth. There, with the soft morning sunlight catching in her hair, she looked more like herself than she had in weeks. They settled on a stone bench surrounded by late-blooming roses. Charlotte shifted slightly, wincing at the strain in her shoulder. Before she could protest, Callum gently placed a hand over hers, concern etched across his features. "I'm fine," she assured him, a small smile curving her lips. He exhaled slowly, searching her face. I need to know you're all right. I need to know that what Graham did, what I did, won't haunt us forever." Charlotte looked at him, her gaze steady. It won't, if you let go. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He understood what she meant. His anger toward Elena, his guilt over her disappearance, the years of pain and mistrust. He had carried all of it for too long. It's not easy, he admitted, voice taut. Charlotte squeezed his hand gently. I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for you to promise me you'll try. No more secrets. No more walls. He swallowed, throat tight with emotion. I promise. A light breeze stirred the garden, and the scent of roses wrapped around them. For the first time in years, Callum felt a glimmer of hope. Charlotte's presence had become a steady force in his life, guiding him towards something better than the darkness he had known. He drew her closer, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. Even in their silence, the bond between them spoke volumes. They were battered, but no longer broken. Morning light filtered through the tall windows of the drawing room where Callum and Charlotte now spent most of their time. The once somber space felt warm and inviting, as if reflecting the changes taking place within its walls. Charlotte sat on a soft velvet sofa, carefully setting a vase of fresh roses on the table. Callum entered with measured steps, carrying 2 cups of tea. His gaze drifted over her shoulder, lingering on the subtle bruise near her bandaged wound. Every time he saw it, his chest tightened with guilt. Yet her reassuring smile reminded him that the past, while haunting, need not define their future. He handed her a cup before settling in the armchair opposite her. For a long moment, they simply held each other's gazes in the bright morning light. The tension that once existed between them had transformed into a soft intimacy, laced with understanding. How are you feeling today? He asked quietly, noticing the careful way she moved her injured arm. Stronger, she admitted, taking a cautious sip of tea. A hint of a smile tugged at her lips. It barely hurts anymore. Callum nodded, relief evident in his features. Silence fell between them, comfortable but charged, as though there were words on the tip of his tongue that he was struggling to say. Eventually, he set his cup down with a soft clink. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Charlotte tilted her head, curiosity shining in her eyes. All right. He drew a breath, gathering his composure. I know our marriage began as a contract, he said, regret flickering across his face. And I won't pretend that I didn't spend a long time resenting that fact. But after everything that's happened, after everything you've shown me, I can't imagine my life without you. Charlotte's hand trembled around the teacup. She placed it aside, her heart pounding in her chest. Callum leaned forward, his voice earnest. I'm asking you to stay, not because of any agreement and not because of debts or obligations. I want you here because you've become the reason I wake up hopeful every morning. You make me believe in the possibility of something more than just protecting myself. Her eyes grew misty, a slow warmth spreading through her chest. Are you sure? She whispered, recalling all the heartbreak and misunderstandings that once stood between them. He rose from the armchair and moved toward her, gently taking her hands in his. I've never been more certain of anything, he murmured, his gaze unwavering. Let me love you, truly love you, and promise me you'll stay by my side. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she nodded before whispering, yes. He cupped her face, brushing away that single tear with his thumb. Thank you, he breathed, voice shaking with relief. They leaned in, and their lips met in a tender kiss, a promise sealed by shared hope, free from contracts or fear. The night air was mild as the last strains of music drifted through the open doors of the newly refurbished ballroom. Callum stood beside Charlotte on the marble floor, the chandelier above them casting gentle light across their entwined fingers. Months ago, their first dance had been filled with hesitation, unspoken secrets, and unyielding walls. Tonight was different. Guests had already departed, leaving only a few staff members tidying up. Yet the soft melody continued at Callum's request, just for the two of them. Charlotte's dress swayed with each step, the fabric brushing against her ankles. Callum's hand rested securely at her waist, guiding her in a slow, steady rhythm. They circled the empty space, content in each other's presence. Their eyes locked, and Charlotte felt the warmth of his affection radiate through her. It wasn't the forced closeness of a marriage contract, nor the guarded tension that once bound them in mutual distrust. Instead, it was a simple, genuine desire to be near each other. Each turn recalled fragments of their shared journey. Her arrival to the estate under grim circumstances, his initial coldness, and the locked door that hinted at his painful past. She remembered the stormy nights, the glances that spoke volumes when neither of them could find the right words. And of course, that moonlit dance on the balcony, brief, filled with unacknowledged longing. Now, there was no hiding. With each graceful pivot, she was reminded of their moments of clarity. Her confrontation with Graham, her decision to protect Callum even when it put her at risk, and Callum finally letting go of the anger that had once consumed him. They had both walked through fire to emerge with a trust forged by hardship and an affection strengthened by perseverance. Callum's fingers tightened against hers, pulling her a fraction closer. She felt his steady heartbeat as she rested her head lightly against his chest. The fragrance of freshly cut roses from the garden lingered in the air, blending with the lilting tune, creating a moment that felt timeless. "I've been thinking," he murmured, voice low in her ear, "about the man I was before, and the man I am now." Charlotte let her eyes close, savoring the warmth of his breath. "You've changed," she whispered. "But so have I." Callum slowed their dance until they stopped altogether in the center of the ballroom. His gaze flickered over her features, as though memorizing every detail. "I don't want to lose this," he said, the vulnerability in his tone echoing the sincerity in his eyes. "I don't want to lose us." She reached up, resting a gentle hand against his cheek. "You won't." A soft smile curved Callum's lips. He lifted her hand and pressed it to his heart, as if to show her that every beat belonged to her. Their foreheads touched, the music swelling around them like a private serenade. "Charlotte," he began, his voice trembling with emotion, "you were never just a contract." He took a breath, gathering his composure. "You were always my fate." Tears glistened in her eyes as those words reached a place deep inside her, one she had guarded for so long. She pulled him closer, letting every doubt and lingering fear melt away. There, under the grand chandelier and the gentle hush of the night, they shared a final dance, one unburdened by secrets or pain, carried only by the steady rhythm of two hearts finally beating in unison.